Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first show in our War in the Mediterranean week. And today's guest needs no introduction because you all follow him on We Have Ways, and he's a prolific author. And he's a friend of mine. So, without further ado, no lengthy introduction today. Good evening, James Holland. How are you? You've had a bit of a tricky day, apparently.
It's been quite full on. We've got we've got trees down, we've got electricity down. We've got my aged parents to sort out. My brother's coming down from London, but there was a train crash in Salisbury yesterday, so he's massively delayed and blah, blah, blah. And it's all a bit sort of logistical nightmare. But as nothing compared to the kind of logistical nightmare of failure to get open the Scheldt.
Well, brilliant. I'm glad you're with us, and thank you very much for taking the time. So, Fortress Malta, it was one, if I'm correct, was that your first book?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Back in the day.
So 18 years ago now, which probably sounds a long time. So we'll talk about what Malta means to you and why it should be talked about in terms of World War II. But before we get into that, as an author now, at the point where you've got kind of a back catalogue now, do you see yourself being one of those George Lucas go back and make endless amendments through them and do new editions, or do you kind of put them, it's done, and then move on to something new all the time?
That's a really good question. No, I think for the most part, I tend to leave them be. You know, the book. That's the book. I made some tweaks for Normandy between hardback and paperback. I guess because Normandy's such a massive subject, and inevitably it sort of got the most response. And there was stuff I kind of learned afterwards that I kind of thought, well, I've got the opportunity to do it. There's a few things actually now with Brothers in Arms. People are coming out of the woodwork, family members and stuff. So between that and the paperback, it might be nice to do a few changes, but not Malta, I don't think. I mean, the big difference is that I haven't really discovered anything that I didn't know then. Except with the state of the medical care and just how bad things were in the summer of 1942. So the end of the Malta Blitz at the end of April, beginning of May 1942. Then there is the sort of there's the kind of sort of slowly clawing back on the air battle for Malta. But all that time up until the pedestal convoy, which finally obviously the Ohio comes in on the 15th of August 1942. In that period between sort of end of March through to August, there's just basically no convoys coming in at all. So that is when it is toughest for the island. And I've got a friend over in Malta called Simon Cousins, and Simon is he's an amateur historian. He's very keen on. He's got loads of interesting Second World War vehicles and what have you. But he is also an avid collector. And years ago, in a kind of flea market in Malta, he picked up a whole load of documents from the medical director on Malta at the time, which had obviously just been left somewhere, and someone had picked them up. And they were just about to go in a sort of scrap heap, basically. And he picked them up for next to nothing. And what he discovered was that the state of the island was far worse, actually, than was being let on. So the authorities had quite a difficult job to do, because they had to kind of tell people that things were quite bad, and had to talk about kind of surrender days and all this kind of stuff when they simply couldn't go on anymore. Obviously not to the public, but they didn't want to kind of to the general public. You don't want to kind of paint too bleak a picture, because you think everyone might give up. So you've got to give them hope and everything. But privately, they're saying something quite different. And the medical director's things are really showing vividly just how bad things are. So you get all this foolscap notes, and what you start seeing is them starting, spring of 1942, they're starting to use the reverse side. So they're recycling bits of paper. And then you see by kind of middle of May, they're starting to cut off half a piece of paper and use that. And then they're kind of doing it upside down again, and it's getting really bad. That's just because there isn't any paper. There just literally is no more paper. But what they're saying on these notes is absolutely fascinating, because what it says, so things like, do not flush the loo, do not wash your hands. These are sort of basics of hygiene. When you have used a bandage, clean it and use it again. This is how bad it is. I mean, so it was absolutely terrible. And I think I'd always thought that things weren't quite as bad as were sometimes made out in the summer of 1942. And I have revised that, and I now think they were worse, a lot worse than I thought. I think they were actually quite close to surrender.
I mean, that's just fascinating in its own right, because I talked with Alan Allport in Battle of Britain Week about Battle of Britain in popular memory. We know that our understanding of that battle has kind of gone up and down since the war, and even during the war, it was talked about in a different way that was talked about at the end of the war. But Malta, because of the George Cross aspect, I suppose, was part of a propaganda story within the war itself. So, but you're now saying it maybe was even worse than we thought it was. I mean, that really is.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was. I think it was really, really desperate. And I think I mean, what you have is you have this clean out of the governing of Malta. You get rid of General Dobby, who's a bit useless, to be honest. I mean, he's all right, but I mean, he's a devout member of the Plymouth Brethren on a country which is 99.9% Catholic, and that doesn't necessarily a problem. But Malta at the beginning of the war is very much sort of B and C list command. Hugh Pugh Lloyd, I still struggle to find anything good about him, and. There is no question that a lot of the problems of the summer of 1942 in terms of the hardships are down to the governing body. Their failure to deal with the March convoy is an absolute disgrace. It really is. So these convoys are so difficult to mount. The Mediterranean is such a narrow channel. It's so visible. You can't hide that convoy. It's not like being in the vast wide open of the Atlantic. There's literally nowhere to hide. And everywhere, as you get to Malta, you are within aircraft distance, and there's no question that the most dangerous thing for aircraft is that combination of submarines, motor torpedo boats, Schnellbooter, and all this kind of stuff, e-boats, and aircraft together. That's a hell of an opposition coming against you, which is why these Malta convoys are so battered. And the March one, 3 ships get in, and immediately there's dark cloud, low cloud, bad weather, and the Luftwaffe suspends operations, as does the Regia Aeronautica, and no one puts in a plan for 24/7 unloading. Even if the skies have been clear at night, they should have been doing it. There is no plan to bring down extra troops to support the stevedores in the unloading process. The moment these come in, there has to be a fantastic plan for, right, this is coming out now, round the clock unloading. And that just isn't put in place. And you cannot, I mean, even now, I just cannot understand how someone didn't think that would be a good idea. I mean, it's just incredible. And what happens is that, the stevedores who would normally do the unloading, they carry on doing the unloading. And at night time, they knock off. And, the theory is, well, you can't have searchlights, but it doesn't matter because there's low cloud. No one's coming over. So what happens is then the clouds lift and all 3 ships are sorry about that, and all 3 ships are sunk in harbour. And sorry, this is my mother still trying to get hold of me.
Popular guy tonight.
Yeah. Sorry, so then the Luftwaffe comes back, sinks all 3 ships in harbour, and it's an absolute disaster. And I can't remember if it's the Pampas or the Talabot, but one of them is you can see the smoke rises sort of 10,000 feet into the sky. There's not a single person on Malta that can't see that and understand what that means. It is just such a terrible home goal, and that is entirely down to the fault of the 3 service chiefs, the deputy governor and the governor.
Well, but I mean, if I remember, I haven't read your book for a little while.
Sorry,
but I remember your book as being essentially very positive about the whole campaign, positive about the Malta spirit and the teamwork and the togetherness. Is this? I mean, you're not a negative writer in that sense. You're not one of those pulling out all the things that went wrong. You leave that to other authors to do that, but. As you're getting older, as I'm getting older, do you find yourself noticing the kind of the failures more now?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I was pretty critical of Hugh Pugh Lloyd in that book and the failure to get Spitfires out to the Middle East. I mean, that is just it's a terrible, that's all part of that kind of sort of disastrous rhubarb campaign of the kind of spring and summer of 1941. I mean, it's a complete waste of time for all the reasons why the Luftwaffe aren't very successful in the Battle of Britain. Those reasons are reversed against RF Fighter Command in 1941. It's stuff like, what have you been doing all this time? I mean, all the summer of 1940, did you not realise there was a reason why fighter planes over Britain from the continent are not doing very well? It's because they haven't got much time over there. And you've got to cross the channel. The same is true in reverse. You know, and I think something like 11,900 Spitfires were built between November 1940 and December 1941, and something like 8,700 Hurricanes, and not a single Spitfire goes over to Malta until the beginning of March 1942. And when that happened, that only happens because Tedder, who is commander-in-chief of the RAF in the Middle East, has sent over Basil Embry, going, what the hell is going on in Malta? You know, I can't make any sense out of them at all. Go and see for yourself. So he sends over Basil Embry, and Embry goes and does a very, very thorough report and comes back and says they need Spitfires and they need a really good ground controller. I mean, it's like, how has Hugh Pugh Lloyd not seen that in all the time that he's been in command as Air Officer Commanding in Malta and throughout 1941? It's not rocket science. It really, really isn't. And, you know, the people to blame are Shelter Douglas and Lee Mallory for hogging the Spitfires back at home, for the Air Ministry Wallers for not just seeing the bigger picture, for Hugh Pugh Lloyd for not asking them. I've been through every single one of Hugh Pugh Lloyd's missives from Malta back to the Air Ministry, and not once does he specify Spitfires. He's just going, I need more fighters. I need more fighters. It's like the whole problem with the Hurricane and the Hurricane being on Malta is not that it's a bad fighter plane, it's that it can't climb very fast. And so the problem you have is what you want to be doing is intercepting the enemy planes from before they get to the island. And you can only do that if you've got enough height, which enables you to maneuver around the sky, get the sun behind you, and dive down on your enemy. But you can't do that if you're still struggling to get to the right height by the time that the enemy are reaching Malta. And that is the fatal flaw with the Hurricane. There's no other flaw. I'm pretty sure I kind of put all that in the book, actually. And I was very critical about the March convoy. Nothing that I've looked at or studied since has changed my mind on that. I mean, so there were some really, really chronic mismanagements, but in between all that, there's some really fantastic people. And you know, Woody Woodhull comes over as a ground controller. He's a complete genius. I mean, the way the submarine flotilla is marshalled by Shrimp Simpson, just brilliant. The way actually, or the Malta Brigade itself, the Devon, Dorset, Hampshires are out there. They're all very, very well managed. Separate incidents of the Royal Navy. The convoys are all kind of, just masterpieces of courage. I mean, they're just absolutely sensational. So there's lots of good, and I think the way the Maltese people sort of manned up and dealt with what was thrown at them is astonishing, really. They were completely deserving of the George Cross. There's no question about that.
But in a sense, what you're saying then is maybe we shouldn't have got to the point where we had to depend on the Maltese people themselves to get us through that battle. The decisions should have been taken earlier by people higher up in a command to not allow ourselves to be in a situation where you're dependent on the population. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. I think there would have been absolutely would be absolutely no issue at all had they sent over Spitfires in 1941. And in really good number, and they could have done it. They proved it. I mean, they've sent over loads and loads of Hurricanes. I mean, the first Hurricanes come in, within 10 days. I think they're like by the 20th or 24th of June, something like that. Certainly by the end of June, they've got Hurricanes over there, and a whole load more arrive over in October. Loads more anti-aircraft guns. Because getting through the Mediterranean in 1940. And the early part of 1941 is quite easy. The time the Luftwaffe is over is comparatively short. You have Fliegerkorps 10, I think, come over in for the illustrious Blitz in January. They're pretty much all gone by the end of February. I think there's one fighter unit that sort of stays on, which is Munchenberg's fighter unit, which stays on till kind of April time. And then it's just the Italians again. Well, that I don't worry about them really particularly. So, there's plenty of opportunity to send over loads of Spitfires in 1941, and they just don't, and it's clearly a mistake. And it's clearly a mistake not to properly think. I mean, you can just imagine it. Okay, we've got a convoy coming in. What are we going to do when it arrives? How are we going to unload it? What are the challenges? Let's try and overcome those. What can we do to kind of mitigate against, potential enemy attack? What can we do to speed up the unloading process? There's loads of things you could do. Why aren't they having these conversations? I just don't know. It's a long and short of it. But I mean, it's not like the British are the only ones not making mistakes. I mean, the whole way that the Axis go about the attack on Malta is pretty flawed as well, to be fair.
And it is that kind of just indicative of how complicated the Mediterranean theatre is, and in that historians are still struggling to get to terms with logistics and how it all works. It is, if people are watching this and watching We Have Ways, it's a tough theatre to kind of begin to understand because there's so many threads to it, so many aspects, and it's you look at some like the Normandy campaign or Market Garden, even Burma, I think is maybe easy to follow the sequentially. The Mediterranean is very confusing, don't you think, generally?
Yeah, I think it is genuine, and I think if you go back to 1940, you think, well, okay, so who's, from a British point of view, what's the threat here? Well, the threat is from Italy, and you're sort of thinking, okay, well, we've got quite a full-on war to sort of deal with in 1940 already. We've got our hands full worrying about the Germans. We're desperately trying to kind of reindustrialize. We've moved the Mediterranean fleet already to Alexandria. We're not really seeing, Egypt and the Suez Canal is the kind of big thing to keep open. So while Malta is clearly a strategic importance, you've got to prioritize and it's basically the British have given up Malta. I mean, by beginning of 1940, they just sort of thought, well, we'll hang on to it, but we're not going to go too mad. And then, of course, the Italians come into the war. The British aren't contemplating having to fight the Germans in the Mediterranean. Germans got their hands full up, elsewhere. So they're just not expecting that. But they're expecting even the Italians to be able to effectively walk in. But then the Italians don't. They have this incredible opportunity to go into Malta. And then suddenly there's this realization that actually Malta's holding out. And hang on a minute, we can actually, now we're in a Mediterranean war with the Italians. Actually, Malta's pretty strategic and pretty important because how else is Italy going to supply its North Africa bases but through the Mediterranean, and blocking its way is Malta, bang in the middle, just 60 miles south of Sicily. So hang on a minute, actually, this is worth building up, and suddenly we've got an opportunistic strategy, which is sort of probe away at people's weaknesses and see where it goes. And after the collapse in France and the loss of the BEF, you're sort of thinking, okay, we've got to rebuild this army, but we've got these sort of Duke forces, these Dominions, UK and Empire forces, and actually the Middle East is a really good sort of confluence, a really good meeting point for troops from South Africa, from Rhodesia, from India, from New Zealand, from Australia to meet and get there without having to go all the way around Africa and all the way up to Britain. Let's do something here, which is why you've got this polyglot kind of Western Desert Force and stuff by the back end of 1940. But at the same time, they're thinking, actually, crikey, we can start really building up Malta's defences. And by Christmas 1940, they really have. They've gone from kind of sort of 32 heavy anti-aircraft guns to 115 or whatever it is. I can't quite remember the exact figures, but it's something like that. And that just keeps coming through. And we're suddenly realizing that actually the Mediterranean is going to be a kernel of our kind of our strategy for the immediate foreseeable, because that's a place where we can actually fight on land and build up our troops and learn tactics and learn on the hoof and build up our forces and keep ourselves in the battle and probe away and find the weak spots and all the rest of it and see how it all pans out. And if we're going to have an opportunistic Mediterranean policy, then Malta is suddenly absolutely the linchpin of the whole thing, because it blocks the access supply lines. And as we all know in war, the operational level and the means of he who can supply himself the most effectively is probably going to win. And so conversely, if you can cut off your enemy's supply lines, then you're in the driving seat, aren't you? And it is amazing that something like, I think 77% of all access supply lines going across the Mediterranean in November 1941 are sunk. That's a huge number. And is there any reason that the Crusader campaign in North Africa is successful for the British when so little supplies are getting through to Rommel's Panzer Army?
A good question from Scott Grimwood here saying, did Crete distract the British from Malta? And we could also add the other things that are happening that are distraction. There's what's going on with the French fleet. There's Vichy. There's worries about Africa. Churchill speaking. There are a lot of things in 4041 that could easily take the British attention away from Malta. We can see the importance now, but there's a lot of things going on.
Yeah, I would say, I'd turn that the other way around. I would say that Crete distracted the Axis from Malta.
Okay.
Rather than the other way around. I mean, as you well know, in Crete there was absolutely no RAF whatsoever. There still was in Malta in 1941. The reason why Malta was being heavily beefed up and Crete wasn't was because Crete made no sense tactically for the Germans to attack it. I mean, it was just utterly, I mean, not entirely pointless, but it's in terms of kind of priorities of strategy, Crete is not a high one on the list. The reason the Germans attack it is because of Hitler's utter obsession about protecting his oil fields in Palestine. He fears that the British will build up a big RAF base on Crete, make it impregnable, and use it as a base for operations against the Balkans. And he's probably right, to be fair, but it's it's obviously the attack on Crete is exactly a month before Barbarossa, which is the largest military campaign of in the history of the world up to that point. And should you be diverting your resources onto something which is strategically insignificant at that time as Crete? And the answer I would say is no. The Second World War is a constant story of people not having quite enough to do what they want to do at any one time, and Malta and Crete are kind of absolutely inextricably bound up with that. But I don't think Crete is a distraction to Malta. No.
That's an interesting point, though. But I mean, coming back to Malta again, I say you're 18 years since you wrote the book. Another thing that you must be dealing with is that pretty much everybody you interviewed for that book must have now passed on. So
they have to a man and to a woman, they've all gone.
So that's a chapter gone. So you said you're maybe not going to revisit it, but the last year and a half for you, we'll bring it back to Malta in a minute. But we have ways and all the incredible changes that we've all been having to do because our industry has changed, touring and writing and everything, and access to archives has changed. You must have had now 1,000 extra conversations than you wouldn't have had things not gone the way the pandemic did. So in general terms, that access you're having to different historians week on week, is that changing your thinking about certain things? Not necessarily Malta, but I mean, I'm finding I'm just now information overload. There's so much stuff coming in that's causing me to reanalyze that it's difficult to keep up with my own brain. Are you in the same sort of situation?
Yes, I suppose so. I mean, the one thing I would say is that most of the conversation I've had has reinforced my overall thesis of the war, which is, as you well know, Woody, is that actually you do need to reinsert that operational level into the narrative.
He said it, folks. He said operational level.
Yeah, well, they are. But I keep banging that drum because it is so important. I've turned it into a cliche, but I haven't really meant to. I've meant to. It's a serious point, and I maintain that the moment you do put that operational level into things, that the Western allies seem an awful lot better than they have done heretofore, and not much has made me change my mind on that. I haven't changed my mind much on the Soviet Union and the deep battle, and I haven't changed my mind much on the kind of on the Japanese and stuff. I suppose what I've really had is my eyes have been opened into other areas. So I think Rob Lyman's book War of Empires has been, which is just behind me. I think that's been quite revelatory. This idea that the Indian Army is the Indian Army because it wants to liberate itself. Not just from the Raj, but from something much worse than the Raj, which is the threat of the Imperial Japanese. I think that makes a huge amount of sense. And I think one has to accept that the Raj was for the most part pretty consensual, certainly in the kind of 1920s and 30s and early part of the 1940s, and that might not seem very politically correct, but that's no reason for kind of not sticking up for what you believe. I think the submarine war in the Pacific is the other thing that's just really kind of I've opened my eyes to. Just the vast amount of Japanese troops that have been killed especially by American submarines is just absolutely astonishing and out of all proportion, really, to kind of the losses in the Atlantic. And the other thing I think is really interesting is the kind of fact that 2 whole armies were destroyed by the Indian Army in Burma and in northeast India, whereas there wasn't a single army that was destroyed in the Pacific campaign. That's because islands are small and you physically can't fit armies on a kind of atoll in the Pacific. But in terms of scale and boots on the ground, it's one has to be careful not to assign strategic importance to boots on the ground, because I don't think the two necessarily go hand in hand. But I also think one needs to be careful not to underestimate the importance of what was going on in Southeast Asia in the overall defeat of the Imperial Japanese. And I'm not just saying that from jingoistic reasons, because I think that it was predominantly an Indian effort rather than a British effort.
Well, we've talked about that before. That's going to be the revolution of the interest from Indian historians and people from that part of the world to tell their own story now. That's going to be. But turning it back to Malta, we had a couple of questions. People saying you've done some of the negatives about the Malta campaign. One of the things about your book and Malta generally, there are some amazing stories of heroism and just getting it done. So, what are a couple of your sort of favorite stories of the positive side of the Malta campaign?
Well, yeah. I mean, the other thing I should preempt on the Malta story is that when I wrote that Malta story, I did it really just from the British perspective and the Maltese perspective, rather than from the 360 degrees. And I don't really like doing it from a just kind of one perspective, because I don't think that's terribly helpful. So I think if I was to do the Malta story again, revisited, or if I was starting afresh, I would see it from a 360. I'd look at Italians and look at Germans and see what they're thinking, rather than just looking at through the prism of the kind of the Allied effort. But having said that, it was absolutely revelatory to me to kind of be able to kind of interview so many people and get to know so many people who've been through so much. And obviously I found the whole submarine thing very interesting. I was lucky enough to get to know Tubby Crawford very well and interview him at great length, who was kind of number one to Wanklin on the Upholder, which has remained the most successful Royal Navy submarine ever in terms of tonnage sunk. I think it was 128,300 tons sunk, which was a phenomenal amount. And all the story of the kind of defence of Malta in the air, Dennis Barnum and George Burling and Tom Neal and all these guys, and they're amazing, So it was fantastic, and it was, I was just utterly captivated by the whole subject. I was utterly captivated by the fact that I was talking to these people who'd actually been there. It was also incredibly new, and that you could go to Malta and there was Grand Harbour looking exactly how Grand Harbour should have looked from the black and white photographs. And I was finding crash sites of hurricanes that had been into a wall and shot down by Messerschmitts coming in under the radar. And there was the clock tower of Imtafa Hospital, just as it was described in the diary I'd been looking at, and it was incredibly intoxicating. And I just got completely consumed by the story, by the contained story of it being an island, had a very sort of clear start, middle, and end, and by a story that I hadn't really known about before, and so it all felt so incredibly fresh and exciting. And suddenly you're writing a story in which you've got kind of sort of frogmen doing things, you've got submarines, you've got destroyer actions and light cruisers in HMS Penelope, you've got Force H and all that kind of stuff. You've got fighter pilots and duels with Messerschmitts and Stuka dive bombers and anti-aircraft gunners and civvies, and it's got it all. I mean, as a story and high drama, it's hard to beat, to be perfectly honest. So there's so many is the long and short of it.
But that's an interesting question that I hadn't thought about asking, but I think I will now, is that you talked about how exciting it was to meet some of these people, and Tom Neal and all these others, and not just for this book but your other books as well. And you and I, we talk on our shows some of the same kind of people, Rob Lyman and Peter Caddick Adams and Al Marion, and we're all within a few years about the same kind of age group, and yet we're also giving people like Victoria Taylor a spotlight. But the next generation of historians, the ones that are 20 plus years younger than us, they won't have had that ability to speak to veterans. Of course, they will have access to more archives than we had when we started out. More information has been digitalized. There's more connectivity between historians. The world has become smaller through YouTube and your podcast. But how much of your enthusiasm came from the fact you were able to meet these people, and where do you think the next generation will be there, if they're writing about World War II, be able to get that enthusiasm from if they can't meet the people who lived through it?
Well, yeah, I think in a weird sort of way, I think there's also a sort of sense of liberation by the fact that the veterans are going, because as you and I well know, that you talk to a kind of, if you talk to a 79-year-old veteran, the memories are going to be pretty good. If you talk to an 85-year-old veteran, they're going to be kind of not bad. If you would talk to a 95-year-old veteran, they're depends on who they are, but there's an awful lot of sort of mixed memories come in. Memory is not constant, and memory is fallible as well. And you know, it is just a fact of life that people might be telling you something and they've got jumbled up, and you know, their memories have been informed by what they've read in books or watched in documentaries too. You know, sort of classic one recently was the, you know, the 51st Highland Division in 1940, you know, which, you know, we were abandoned by Churchill. You know, I got there and these monster panzers came up, and, you know, and all I was given was this crappy boys anti-tank rifle and all this sort of stuff. And, you know, I'm not sure they thought that at the time. I mean, you know, the Churchill didn't abandon them. You know, France was our ally, and they were part of the line. And, you know, the French Corps commander to which they were attached made some bad decisions, which meant they got cut off. But it wasn't anything to do with Churchill. And the fact of the matter is they were overrun by the 7th Panzer Division, which only had T-35s and T-38s, all of which could have been penetrated by a boys anti-tank rifle. So the idea that, you know, but you couldn't say that to one of those veterans, because as far as they're concerned, they were wronged and it was a terrible injustice, and, you know, but that's stuff that got planted into their heads after the war. I'm pretty certain of it. And it's very difficult. You can't sit there listening to someone who was actually there and say, "Oh, I don't think that was true." And he goes, "Well, you weren't there, mate." You know, but we as historians can know quite often an awful lot more than they do. They have their experiences, but what do they see? 20 yards either side of them or whatever. You know, I mean, you know, I'm probably doing them a disservice to a certain extent, but there is a liberation in a way through these veterans going, because you've now got no one to contradict you. And what that does mean is you can go back to really original sources, you know, contemporary diaries and stuff. And really, I mean, what I found, I've got every bit as excited looking at diaries and letters for my Sherwood Rangers book as I did meeting people back in Malta times, because suddenly I was finding this diary that was written then on that day. That was not a lie. You know, whatever they were thinking at that's what they were thinking at that moment. And that gave me a level of immediacy that you don't get from talking to someone 50, 60, 70, 80, you know, 75 years after the event. You just don't. So,
but I completely get that. But,
you know, I'm grieving the loss of that generation. Don't get me wrong. You know, and you've met some incredible people as well, and you know what it's like. There's something incredibly thrilling and exciting about meeting these guys who actually were there, who went through it. You know, they're that link to real events.
Well, that's the thing. It's an absolute direct link, isn't it? I mean, when you had your successful War Fest and you had the late Stan Perry there, for many people in that audience, I wasn't there myself, that was the amazing connection, because you and I have taken it for granted to some extent that we've been able to brush shoulders with veterans and count them as my friends and have them call me up for my birthday and things like that.
Yeah.
But a lot of people haven't had that access. So you could have got out archives on that stage and it would have appealed to people, but not in the same way as presenting them someone who was actually there in those battles. And I think that's, even if some of the veterans give a slightly warped version of the memories they have, that doesn't change the fact you're still speaking to someone who actually lived through those moments. And I do wonder how the next generation of historians will be able to kind of find that ignition for their enthusiasm.
Yeah, but that hasn't stopped subsequent generations sort of, you know, studying ancient Rome or Battle of Agincourt or Napoleonic Wars or whatever. And I think actually with the distance of time, the excitement then comes from looking at documents that are signed by Hitler or Churchill or a diary that was written on the day on D-Day. You know, think 50 years down the line, imagine what it'd be like picking up a diary of someone who landed on D-Day, and there's his writing, and there's his pencil, and there's his pen and his ink that was written on that day, you know, and finding a grain of sand stuck down the spine or something. I mean, you know, those sort of things I think will be every bit as exciting, combined with, you know, all the time we're getting, you know, researching is easier because of, you know, outside of COVID, of course, but you know, even side of COVID, you know, travel is easier, it's cheaper. We've got digital cameras now. It's easier to kind of collate and collect research. The world is a smaller place, blah blah blah. So I think there's still. I mean, I don't know about you, but well, I know you're saying you've got this sort of information overload. I mean, you've got this sense that there's still so much to learn. This is such a massive subject. There's still so many nuances and rabbit holes and cul-de-sacs that one can go down and research and find, and nuggets that have been found in attics. I mean, we're one of the things from We Have Ways is that we're still getting contacted by people who are offering new information that they got from their dad or their granddad or their great uncle or even great grandfather, which is adding to our understanding. You have to remember that in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when everyone has been involved in the Second World War of a certain generation, you're not ordinary, you're not exceptional, you're ordinary, you're just like everyone else. So what your information and your knowledge and that pile of stuff in the attic is not exceptional at all. It's just boring and normal in the eyes of many. So I suspect a lot more material is still yet to come out, and I think that's going to be incredibly thrilling. The idea that there's still more diaries, there's still more interviews that people have done which have just been forgotten about. So I think there's plenty of excitement to come, to be honest.
Oh no, I agree. There'll be other ways of getting the excitement, but it will be at the end of an era when we no longer.
Won't it ever? I mean,
and
yeah. No, I agree. I agree for that generation. I can't believe it that Tom and Jeff Walham and all those guys, all the amazing people in the Malta, but Peter Rothwell, Mickey Montebello, Diana Barnum, Tubby Crawford, all these guys. I remember going out there, spending time with them out in Malta, sitting on the balcony of the Praluna Hotel in Schliemer and having sundowners with Peter Rothwell, and it was amazing. John and Juice, all these guys. I mean, they became my friends. I was really fond of them. Frank Rickson, Mimi Turner. They were amazing people, and they had such spirit, and they were so generous and kind, and so happy that someone like me at the time in his 30s, as I was then, was interested in their story of something that happened a long time ago. I was just eternally grateful to them, and now I look back on it, I can see that they were very grateful to me because that I was giving them a voice and putting them on a page, and and I just didn't see that then at all. I felt that the favor was all them to me rather than the other way around. And I completely cherish those moments, and I can't believe it that we're at that stage where Winkle Brown's gone and Jeff and Tom Neal and all these guys, there's so few and far between now. And all the Americans, all the Germans I got to know, all the flipping Maori I interviewed, Les Munro, Dambusters, and so on. It's heartbreaking.
Wow. But returning back to Malta, because we've got a few more minutes on that. But the other thing about Malta is that it's just a brilliant place to go and visit. I have only been once for a week, and the history is just everywhere. And you realise World War II is just one of all these series of occupations, and it connects to Bible and prehistory and Gozo and stuff. It's just, for anyone who's interested in the past, I felt I must have looked like an idiot because I think I was walking around with my mouth open like that at everything, because it was just history. So, I mean, Malta has seen a resurgence, not just since your book, but the museums have been lifted recently. Mm-hmm. There's, they got the Lascari War Room and things like that. We're going there now. So I think there was an era when Malta wasn't on people's radar for going to visit in terms of World War II. And as you said a few minutes ago, travel is easier now. So I think Malta's gonna become more and more popular for the history reasons, not just World War II, but everything, because it is just such an insanely good place to visit. So
I think I've been there pretty much every year. I didn't go there last year, but pretty much every year since I first went. And I was there a couple of weeks ago. And it's a funny place because it sort of gets under your skin, Malta. There's lots of bits of it which are really grotty and really annoying, and obviously there's a sort of horrible corruption going on there at the moment, and there's far too much traffic and all the rest of it. But there's something about it that's really alluring, and I think you're right. It's that incredible sense of history. History is absolutely everywhere, and I know I've got friends over there now, so I kind of sort of hook up with them, and it's nice to see them and keep that relationship going. But it's also that, it's magic in a way, because, that's where, for me, my kind of career as a historian began with Malta, really. So I kind of sort of owe the island a bit of a debt in a funny sort of way. But I always love it when I go back there and I see it, and they're the bastions, they're the upper Barraccas, there's Manuel Island, a nod to Tubby and Wanks and, you know, Tompkinson of Urge and all the rest of it. You know, Tompkinson's still out there, just outside Grand Harbour at the bottom of the sea. You know, on HMS Urge, they were found there. You know, there's also still new discoveries, of course, because Urge was only found a couple of years ago, and they've now sort of positively identified its stuff. It's now war grave and everything. But you know, so again, it's you know, you keep having these little connections and things that come back to you, which you never lose sight of. So I mean, if anyone does go out to Malta, and with an interest in the Second World War, you know, so many places to visit, so many good things to see, and I reckon it will get under your skin a little bit. It just does.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Mediterranean campaign, we talked a little bit earlier about, it is a complicated one to understand. And again, do you think it falls a little bit victim of kind of the nationalistic view of things? Is Malta, apart from the people who live there themselves, an essentially British story? And then other parts of the Mediterranean, you know, Sicily, I know that's British and American, but I think Americans see Sicily as their story. So has there been a bit of a national divide with how we look at the Mediterranean campaign as well? So Americans, it's all about Tunisia and Kasserine Pass. Brits, it's El Alamein. Do you think we need to start looking at it more globally again?
Yeah, I do, and I think there's this huge temptation to sort of belittle the Mediterranean campaign, but you know, it is incredibly important because it sucks away a lot of resources that Germany can't afford to have lost. You know, I mean, if it's going to have any chance in the Soviet Union, and he's absolutely 100% on the job, and it just isn't. And part of that is because of the sort of the drain of the Mediterranean. You know, it's where Mussolini comes a cropper, and you know, it enables the British to kind of build up their armed forces and learn on the job. You know, it sees the development of tactical air power. It sees the development of the army. It's a sort of melting pot, isn't it? You know, and when I talk about the Mediterranean, I'm also talking about the Middle East. You know, Iraq, Syria, Iran. You know, don't kind of underplay those places either. You know, on one level, you could have abandoned the Mediterranean and, you know, still won the war because, you know, something like the oil fields of the Middle East, for example, they're only funding the war effort in the Middle East. They're not crucial to Britain's war effort outside of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. But the Mediterranean has an important sort of +1 - 1 thing, which is that you get the benefit of having it yourself, but you also get the benefit of denying it to your enemy. And I think that's where it's really, really important. And you know, it breaks the Italians, the Mediterranean campaign, obviously. And in many ways, it sort of breaks the Germans as well, because although you're not having the slaughter that you're having on the Eastern Front, of course, you know, it's still drawing a huge amount of resources from the Reich down into that theatre, resources that they can't afford. I mean, you know, it is amazing when you think that even by start of Barbarossa, they still only have 20 panzer divisions, you know, of which 17 are available, I think, or 13 or something, or 14 are available for Barbarossa itself, of which, you know, 3 are in North Africa. Well, you know, as a proportion of 20, that's quite a lot. You know, when you've got such a kind of roll of the dice, kind of all or nothing gamble with Barbarossa, you know, that's quite a kind of dent in your armory.
And you just mentioned the Italians there, but you know, I think we're all guilty. I'm trying my hardest. I've got an Italy at War Week coming up in November. So 4 Italian historians, 1 British. We're looking at some of the important Italian engagements, but we're all a little bit guilty of dismissing the Italians too much when we talk about World War II. We just leap straight into when the Africa Corps arrived in North Africa. We tend to dismiss the Italian forces early. And I think that's an aspect we need to bring back into the story, which of course connects to Malta completely. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely would. I mean, the problem with the Italians is the Italians are not, you know, they're not ready to fight a modern war against, you know, in the same sort of scale of modernity and industrial might and access to resources that Britain has, or America, or even Germany. I mean, they're just not in that league. They're just not that developed as a nation, as a fighting competent nation. You know, they're landlocked effectively because they're in the Mediterranean, and you know, the British control the kind of access in and out of the Mediterranean, and they've got what they've got. And once you lose it, there's no way of replacing that. And they lose so much shipping in 1940 to 1941 that there's no means of replacing that. And the world's resources move around the world by ship, more than by anything else. So if you haven't got shipping, you're a bit stuffed, frankly. And that's the problem that the Italians have. They just don't have resources themselves in Italy. And they don't have any means of kind of replenishing it once it starts to go. So which is why by kind of 1943 and the Sicilian campaign, what shipping they've got is basically coastal lighters and stuff, because all the big stuff got sunk 2 years ago. It's all at the bottom of the Mediterranean, and they're just fighting a war that they're too small to fight. They just don't have the resources and they don't have the know-how. And the military has stagnated. It hasn't advanced. It hasn't developed. The officer class is really behind. It's all about the infantry, and it isn't about the infantry by the start of the war. They just can't cope with it. That's the bottom line. And what you see with Italy, with Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all those sort of nations that get in the war. All those nations get into the war without the people really wanting to, and that's a problem. And it doesn't matter whether you're a dictatorship or not. If the people aren't behind you, it's never going to end up well. And you see that as a consistency. They've been brought into a war which 90% of the population don't want to fight, and that's a problem.
I get that. Yeah, I mean, and Giulio, an Italian who comes on my show, he's saying that we were talking about the French now kind of appreciating their dark past. I always make this point that I can go and switch on the French TV. There'll be a documentary about Vichy France and Le Rafle, because they're kind of, that's what they're doing now. But Italy, he says, they just haven't really gone back and looked at it. They've just kind of, it's in the past. We've moved on. So there aren't really these kind of cutting edge historians in Italy kind of going back and reevaluating, reanalyzing it. And it's a shame, because even if they're a lesser participant nation, it's like, if you use a football analogy, the teams that win the World Cup, they've still had to beat those lesser teams in the earlier rounds to get there. And I think, to me, maybe Italy, Hungary, Romania, they're not changing the outcome of the war at all, but they're still having that effect along the way, that they're having to be eliminated by us, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the other problem about it is that there's a massive disconnect between the political elites and the military. And so, you've got Mussolini going, let's go for it, come on, let's go, boys. And all the generals are sort of going, we're just not really, heart's not really in it. And that's Graziani, moving just across the Egyptian border in September 1940, very reluctantly, because basically his hands been tied behind his back, and he's been sort of ordered to do so by Mussolini, but doesn't want to. So your commander of your Italian forces doesn't think it's a good idea. Well, that doesn't set a great tone, does it? And they declare war and attack. The bombers come over on Malta on the 11th of June 1940. It's a handful of bombers dropping a few bombs from a very great height. Heart's not in it. No one makes an effort. They could have walked into Malta had they really thought about it. Had there been a proper plan, thought about it, worked out how to do it beforehand, Malta would have been theirs, and the Mediterranean campaign could have been quite different. But they didn't do it because there's no joined up thinking with the Italians. There's no real will. There's no will from the people, and everyone knows it. And everyone knows that the only reason Mussolini's gone to war is because he thinks France and Britain together are finished, and he's got it wrong. He's made a mistake.
Which brings us back, I suppose, to the idea that both Axis and Allies have, at various points of the 40, 41, 42, kind of failed to realize Malta's significance. They've either overplayed it or underplayed it, or supported it too late, or not attacked it when they should have done. And therefore, in a weird way, despite the fact you wrote about what did happen there, Malta is also an interesting kind of counterfactual discussion point, because there are so many variations of things that could have happened earlier that, as you said, there could have changed the course of things. Because the Mediterranean, I think I in my early days, I kind of thought it as a secondary theater to other ones. And now I'm realizing it's integral. It's affecting the Atlantic convoys. It's affecting North Africa. It's affecting European thinking. It's not peripheral. In many ways, it's the center of things.
No, it absolutely isn't. And I tell you, if there's, the accusation being that sort of the British are too obsessed with the Mediterranean, and particularly British historians, and that's why we bang on about Alamein and stuff. The one person who was completely obsessed with the Mediterranean was Hitler. And the whole point about doing the pact with Italy was so that he doesn't have to worry about his southern flank. You have to remember that Germany in the center of Europe is incredibly vulnerable because it can be attacked from all sides. So the whole point about the Italian partnership is that's that bit of it sorted. You don't have to worry about the south anymore. So once Italy makes a hogwash of it with the invasion of Greece and everything, and gets absolutely trounced by the British, what's Hitler supposed to do? He either got to sort of abandon it or completely and lay himself open, or go to the rescue. And it's very interesting that an appreciation in 1942 by the planning department at the OKW, the Ober Command of Development, which is the German General Staff, assesses that the Atlantic and North Africa / Mediterranean are of equal strategic importance. Well, they're absolutely not. I mean, the Atlantic is clearly way more important strategically than the Mediterranean and North Africa. But it tells you so much about German thinking, that the Germans think that. For as far as the Germans are concerned, it is. I mean, they've misread the strategic situation. But for them, it's incredibly important. And it continues to be incredibly important, which is why they're constantly reinforcing it all the way through. You have to kind of say, okay, 50 divisions compared to kind of 300 divisions on the Eastern Front doesn't sound like an awful lot. But don't forget, the only reason there's not 300 divisions there is because of the constraints of geography. There's only so many divisions you can fit into a kind of small landmass, like the Aegean and Greece and the Balkans and Italy. 50 divisions is a hell of a lot. There's kind of only 6 divisions left in the entire size of the British Army in the Second World War. So it's a huge drain on resources. And don't forget the fact that in the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe loses just over 700 aircraft on the Eastern Front, but 3,500 in the Mediterranean. And the Luftwaffe is the biggest sap of resources in 1943 and 1944, not the army and not tanks and Tigers and Panthers and everything. So, anyone who suggests that the Mediterranean is not of enormous strategic importance is just talking out their arse, because if the Germans think it's of strategic importance, it's of strategic importance.
By default, it is to us as well, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, I will let you go, Nimmy, because I know you've got to get ready for We Have Ways and you've got phone calls to deal with. But just to kind of conclude things, I think you talked about Robert Lyman's War of Empires book. I'd like to think in maybe 10, 20 years' time, there'll be a new generation of historians re-evaluating Malta and the Mediterranean, Crete and all these places and putting some really new work into this, because I feel maybe there's not much more to say on Market Garden. Maybe there's not much we can say about Normandy anymore, but there's definitely things I think we can say about the Mediterranean campaign in North Africa. And I'm hoping that's what's going to happen next. I hope I live long enough to see the next wave of reevaluations, because I feel
it's been 20 years since there's been an overall view of sort of big campaign history on the Malta story, and I think there is absolutely a piece to be done by a new young historian on the siege of Malta, from both from all sides, 360 degrees views, with new perspectives. There absolutely is, and I'm sure it would do incredibly well if it was published.
Well, what a fantastic way to end up. So, I'm going to just thank you very much for joining us and taking time out of your busy day, folks. I'll tell you, we've got one show coming up. I've got another show. If you can either go and watch James and Al on We Have Ways, or you can stick with me or watch both, watch one and catch up. In 35 minutes time, I'm doing a show about a potential miniseries at all costs about Operation Pedestal. So my guest is joining for the USA to talk about that. So watch this place, 35 minutes time. Join me for that show then. But right now, it just remains me to say thank you very much, James Holland, for joining us this evening. And I sense that once you start talking, it all just comes out, because you love talking about this, and you've got to do it all again on We Have Ways in half an hour time.
Yeah, so, that's absolutely fine. Well, lovely to see you, and thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you very much, and I will see you all again next time. So, folks, this is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV saying I will see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.